The first time someone told me I no longer belonged in my own home. The words were spoken so casually that for a moment I thought I had misunderstood them. It was strange how a sentence that small could feel heavier than 30 years of memories. This house had never just been a building to me. Every corner carried a piece of my life. The front door still creaked the same way it had the day we moved in, when my son was 6 years old, and insisted on racing through every room to claim which one would be his. The kitchen window still faced the same old oak tree where he used to climb, despite my constant warnings that he would break his neck one day. I had built this house with my own hands, and with sacrifices no one ever saw. Back then, money was tight. My husband and I worked long hours. I remember evenings when we ate simple meals because every spare dollar went into construction materials. Brick by brick, payment by payment, we built what we believed would be a safe place for our family. Safety was always the promise of this home. And for many years, it was exactly that. Even after my husband passed away, the house remained the one constant thing in my life. The silence after his death had been unbearable at first, but the walls still carried echoes of laughter. My son stayed close during those years. He visited often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes simply sitting at the kitchen table talking about work or life. He used to say something that meant everything to me. "Mom, this house will always be yours. Don't ever worry about anything." Those words felt like reassurance. But sometimes reassurance slowly transforms into something else when new people enter the story. The first time I met my son's wife, I wanted to like her. Her name was Emily. She arrived with confidence, polished manners, and a smile that seemed carefully practiced. She was intelligent, articulate, and clearly ambitious. My son looked happy beside her, and that was enough for me. Happiness for him meant peace for me. At least, that was what I believed at the time. When they got married, I welcomed her warmly. I cooked dinners for them. I offered the guest room whenever they needed a place to stay. I told everyone proudly that my son had found someone strong and capable. Strength, however, can sometimes carry another face. At first, Emily's suggestions sounded harmless. "This house has so much potential," she said one afternoon while walking through the living room, "but it could look much more modern." I nodded politely. Homes evolve over time, after all. I had nothing against a little renovation. But renovation soon turned into something different. The first change was small. She replaced the curtains in the living room. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon and found them gone, replaced with sleek gray panels that made the room feel colder somehow. "Oh, I hope you don't mind," she said with a bright smile. "The old ones looked a bit outdated." I forced a smile. "It's your home too now," I replied. The words tasted strange in my mouth. I meant them kindly, but something about saying them made me uneasy. Over the next few weeks, the changes continued. The family photos on the hallway wall were removed and replaced with abstract art pieces that meant nothing to me. The old wooden coffee table my husband had built was quietly moved into the garage. Emily explained everything in a tone that sounded helpful. "We're just refreshing things," she said, "making the house feel new." New. That word began appearing more often. New furniture. New layout. New rules. Yes, rules. The first rule appeared during dinner one evening. Emily looked around the kitchen and sighed softly. "I think we should organize meals differently," she said. I looked up from my plate. "What do you mean?" "Well," she continued, "since we're all living here now, we should have a structured schedule. Cooking days, cleaning days, things like that." Her words were polite, but something underneath them felt different. This had never been a house governed by schedules and instructions. It had always been a place of comfort. My son shifted in his chair, but didn't say anything. That silence was the first crack in something I had always believed was unbreakable. Weeks turned into months. Emily's confidence inside the house grew steadily. At first it was organization. Then it was decisions. Then it was authority. I noticed small things. She began referring to the house as our place. She spoke about future renovations as if they were already approved. And gradually, without anyone announcing it directly, I felt my role inside the home shrinking. The kitchen I had cooked in for decades slowly became her space. The living room became her design project. Even the garden, where I had spent countless mornings planting flowers, was suddenly scheduled for landscaping improvements. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking on the phone. "Yes, it's our house," she said casually. The sentence hit me harder than I expected. Our house. I stood in the hallway quietly, listening. Ownership had always been a simple fact in my mind. I had never needed to mention it. The house had been mine because I built it, paid for it, and lived in it. But Emily spoke as if that history didn't exist. That was the moment when the contrast first became clear. Gratitude versus entitlement. I had welcomed her with kindness. She walked through the door with certainty. My son noticed the tension sometimes. Or at least I think he did. But instead of confronting it, he avoided it. If Emily suggested a change, he agreed. If she criticized something in the house, he laughed it off. The boy who once defended me fiercely against playground bullies now avoided defending me at all. Not because he had stopped loving me, but because conflict inside a marriage can quietly silence people. That silence slowly became the loudest thing in the house. One evening, Emily approached me while I was sitting in the living room. She held a tablet in her hands, showing renovation plans. "We've been thinking," she said, "about expanding the master bedroom." I nodded slowly. "That sounds nice. But the expansion would require some rearranging," she continued. "What kind of rearranging?" She looked at me carefully. "Well, your room is directly next to that wall." Something cold moved through my chest. "And," I asked. "We may need to relocate you temporarily," she said, "just while construction happens." Relocate. The word sounded clinical, almost professional. "Where would I go?" I asked quietly. "Oh, we could find something nearby," she said casually. "Maybe a small apartment, just until things are finished." I looked at her for a long moment. Temporary solutions sometimes reveal permanent intentions. My son sat nearby, but kept his eyes on his phone. The contrast between past and present felt unbearable in that moment. The little boy who once begged me to read bedtime stories now couldn't even look at me, while someone suggested moving me out of my own house. I didn't argue that night. Instead, I simply said something calm. "We'll talk about it later." But the tension had already begun building towards something inevitable. And that inevitable moment arrived sooner than I expected. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that begins quietly, but ends by changing everything. I had just finished watering the garden when I walked inside. Emily was standing in the living room. My son stood beside her. Both of them looked serious. That was the first sign something had already been decided. "Can we talk?" she asked. Her tone was firm. Not rude, but firm in a way that suggested the outcome of the conversation had already been determined. I sat down slowly. "What's going on?" Emily crossed her arms. "We've been thinking about the future," she said. My son remained silent. "We believe it's time for a change," she continued. "What kind of change?" She took a breath. Then she said the sentence that changed everything. "You need to move out." The words were spoken with calm certainty. Not anger. Not hesitation. Just certainty. For a moment, the room felt silent in a way I had never experienced before. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "What did you just say?" Emily didn't flinch. "This house belongs to our family now," she said, "and we need space to build our future." Our family. The phrase carried a meaning that excluded me entirely. I looked at my son. He still hadn't spoken. "Is this what you want?" I asked him. He hesitated. Then he said something that felt worse than anger. "It's just the best solution for everyone. Everyone. Except me. Weakness versus strength." In that moment, they believed they held all the power. I looked around the living room. The new curtains. The new furniture. The missing photographs. Everything suddenly made sense. This wasn't a conversation. It was the final step of a long plan. "You can't just throw me out," I said quietly. Emily's expression hardened. "We can," she replied. She reached into a folder and placed something on the table. A printed notice. "We've already looked into the legal side," she said. My son looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. "You should start packing tonight," Emily continued. "It will be easier if we handle this quickly." I stared at the paper without touching it. Confidence versus uncertainty. Emily believed the outcome was guaranteed. But something about the situation felt strangely unfinished. Then it happened. A sudden knock echoed through the house. 3 firm knocks. Everyone froze. Emily frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked my son. He shook his head. The knock came again. Louder this time. I stood slowly and walked toward the door. When I opened it, 2 police officers were standing on the porch. For a moment, none of us spoke. "Good afternoon," one of them said calmly. "We received a report regarding a property dispute." Behind me, Emily's confident posture suddenly stiffened. Her certainty had lasted exactly 3 minutes. The officer looked past me into the house. "May we come inside?" And just like that, the balance of power in the room began to shift. Emily had been certain the house belonged to her future. But as the officers stepped across the threshold, I realized something quietly important. This situation was not as simple as she believed. And whatever happened next would reveal truths no one in that room was prepared to face. The moment the police officers stepped inside my house, the air in the room shifted in a way that no one could pretend not to notice. Just seconds earlier, Emily had been standing tall beside the coffee table, arms crossed, voice steady, completely certain of her authority. She looked like someone who had already won an argument before it began. Now, that certainty flickered. Confidence has a strange relationship with truth. It can grow quickly when no one challenges it. But the moment reality walks through the door, confidence sometimes collapses like a house built on sand. The taller officer glanced around the living room calmly. His partner stood near the door, observing quietly. "We received a report about a property dispute," the taller one said. "Someone claimed there was an attempt to remove a legal resident from the home." Emily recovered quickly. Her voice regained its firmness. "Yes," she said, stepping forward. "That's correct. We're asking her to move out." She pointed toward me, as if I were a problem that needed solving. The officer turned his attention to her. "And you are?" "Emily Carter," she replied confidently. "My husband and I live here." The officer nodded. "And the homeowner?" Emily didn't hesitate. "That would be us." Those 3 words echoed through the room with complete certainty. Us. My son stood beside her, silent but supportive. His eyes flickered briefly toward me, but he avoided direct contact. Silence filled the space for a moment. The officer's expression remained neutral. "Ma'am," he said calmly, "property disputes are usually resolved through documentation. Ownership, tenancy, or legal residence needs to be verified." Emily nodded quickly. "Of course," she said, "but we're handling it privately. She just needs to leave." The officer looked at me then. "And you are?" I met his eyes calmly. "My name is Margaret Carter," I said. "And how long have you lived here, Mrs. Carter?" 32 years. The number seemed to hang in the air. 32 years. Longer than Emily had even known my son. The officer nodded again. Do you have any documentation regarding ownership or residency? Emily spoke before I could answer. She doesn't need documentation, she said firmly. This house belongs to our family now. Our family. Those words again. But this time, they carried less weight. The officer turned his head slightly toward her. Ma'am, he said gently, ownership claims require proof. Emily hesitated. Only for a second. Then she pointed toward me again. Well, she can't prove anything either, she said. The officer looked back at me. Mrs. Carter. I walked slowly toward the hallway. Give me a moment, I said. Behind me, I could feel Emily's eyes following every step. She believed this moment would expose me. But what she didn't understand was something simple. Experience prepares people for storms long before clouds appear. I entered my bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of my dresser. Inside was a small metal box. It wasn't fancy, just something practical. But inside that box were documents that told the real story of this house. Not the story Emily believed. The truth. As I carried the box back into the living room, memories began to surface. Memories that explained why those papers existed at all. Years earlier, long before Emily entered our lives, I had learned a painful lesson about trust. After my husband passed away, some relatives had suddenly become very interested in our property. People who hadn't visited in years suddenly appeared with advice and suggestions. One cousin insisted the house should be managed by the family. Another suggested selling it and dividing the profits. At first, I thought they were simply concerned. But concern quickly turned into pressure. Phone calls became arguments. Arguments became threats. One afternoon, I received a letter from a lawyer representing one of them, claiming partial ownership through complicated family inheritance claims. The claim was nonsense, but it forced me to confront a truth I had never considered. Kindness does not protect you from people who see opportunity instead of family. That was when I met Daniel Harper. He was an older lawyer with calm eyes and a voice that carried quiet authority. After reviewing my situation, he said something I never forgot. Margaret, he said gently, trust is beautiful inside families. But when property enters the conversation, preparation is wiser than hope. He helped me organize everything. Title verification, property protection clauses, residency rights. Every document was structured carefully to prevent anyone from manipulating ownership or forcing removal from the property. At the time, I had done it for protection against distant relatives. I never imagined those protections would one day matter inside my own living room. But life has a way of revealing why preparation matters. I placed the metal box on the table. The officer watched with quiet interest. Emily crossed her arms again. You really think paperwork changes anything? She asked coldly. I didn't respond to her. Instead, I opened the box and removed a thick folder. Inside were certified documents, deeds, legal certifications, property registration, all carefully organized. I handed the folder to the officer. He began flipping through the pages slowly. His partner stepped closer to look as well. The room grew silent again. But this silence felt very different from before. Emily shifted slightly. Confidence versus uncertainty. Moments earlier, she had believed this conversation would end quickly. Now she watched the officer's expression carefully. My son looked nervous. Is that really necessary? Emily asked. The officer didn't look up. Yes, he said calmly. He turned another page. And another. Then he stopped. Mrs. Carter, he said, looking at me, these documents indicate you are the sole legal owner of the property. The sentence landed in the room like a stone, dropped into water. Emily blinked. That can't be right, she said immediately. The officer turned the document toward her. This deed shows the property registered exclusively under Margaret Carter. Emily stepped forward quickly. That must be outdated, she insisted. My husband lives here too. The officer nodded. Living somewhere does not automatically transfer ownership. Emily's voice sharpened. But we're family. The officer's tone remained calm. Family relationships do not change property law unless ownership is transferred legally. My son finally spoke. Wait, he said quietly. What does that mean? The officer looked at him. It means your mother owns this house. The truth sounded almost simple when spoken out loud. But the emotional weight behind it was enormous. Emily's confidence cracked. But she was supposed to move out, she said. The officer raised an eyebrow. On what legal basis? Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since the argument began, she had no immediate answer. Illusion versus reality. The illusion had lasted months. The reality had arrived in less than 10 minutes. The officer continued reading. There are also residency protection clauses here, he said. My son looked confused. What does that mean? It means, the officer replied calmly, no one can remove Mrs. Carter from this property without her consent. Emily's face turned pale. But this is our home too, she insisted. The officer nodded slightly. You may live here, but that does not grant authority to evict the owner. The word owner seemed to echo. Owner. For months, Emily had spoken as if that word belonged to her future. Now reality placed it firmly back where it had always been. My son looked at me. Mom, why didn't you tell us? I met his eyes. You never asked. The silence between us carried years of unspoken emotion. Betrayal versus accountability. He had allowed Emily's confidence to guide him. Now he was realizing something uncomfortable. The house he believed he controlled had never belonged to him at all. Emily wasn't ready to surrender yet. This is ridiculous, she said sharply. She can't expect us to just live under her rules. The officer looked at her calmly. Legally speaking, that is exactly the situation. Emily laughed bitterly. So you're saying she has power over everything? The officer shrugged slightly. She has legal authority as the property owner. Authority. The word hung heavily in the air. But power isn't always about authority. Sometimes power is about choice. I looked at my son. His shoulders had slumped slightly. The arrogance he carried earlier had disappeared. In its place was something closer to shame. Mom, he said quietly. But he didn't finish the sentence. Emily turned toward him, frustrated. Say something, she demanded. He rubbed his forehead. I didn't know, he said. That sentence revealed the entire problem. He had never bothered to know. He had simply followed Emily's certainty. Experience versus arrogance. One prepares quietly. The other collapses when tested. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to me. Based on these documents, he said calmly, there is no legal basis for removing Mrs. Carter from this property. Emily's shoulders stiffened. But she can't stop us from living here. The officer nodded. That depends entirely on the homeowner. All eyes turned toward me. This was the moment where revenge would have been easy. I could have asked them to leave immediately. I could have returned the humiliation they tried to give me. But strength does not always require punishment. Sometimes strength means drawing a line without crossing it. I took a slow breath. This house has always been a home, I said quietly. No one spoke. I welcomed you here, I continued, looking at Emily. Not because you had a right to it, but because you were family. Emily looked away. But family doesn't mean control, I said. The room remained silent. I will not be forced out of my own home. The officer nodded slightly. That is your legal right. I looked at my son. You are still my son, I said. His eyes filled with something close to regret. But respect must exist inside this house, I continued. Emily said nothing. For the first time since she moved in, she seemed unsure of her position. Integrity versus entitlement. The difference had finally become visible. The officers prepared to leave. If any further disputes arise, the taller one said, they should be handled legally. I nodded. Thank you. They stepped outside. The door closed behind them. The house fell into silence once more. But it was not the same silence as before. This silence carried truth. My son looked around the room slowly. At the furniture. At the walls. At the house he suddenly realized he never owned. Mom, he said quietly. But again, he didn't know what words to follow it with. Emily remained, standing near the table. The confidence that once filled her voice had disappeared. Sometimes people mistake kindness for weakness. But kindness, backed by preparation, becomes something stronger. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just unshakable. I walked slowly toward the window and looked outside at the oak tree my son used to climb. A home is never just walls. It is sacrifice, memory, protection, and wisdom earned through experience. Those who try to take control without understanding the foundation beneath them eventually learn the same lesson. Power does not belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the person who prepared long before the argument began.